the Galactic Concordat had kept peace among 17 spacefaring civilizations for 6,000 years, and in all that time, they had never faced a threat they could not handle through careful diplomacy and measured military response. The Council chambers on Sentinel Prime were ancient and beautiful, with walls of living crystal that sang soft harmonies when important decisions were being made, and today, those crystals hummed with a frequency that spoke of fear. High Arbiter Solen stood at the center of the great circular room and watched the holographic displays that showed world after world burning under the assault of the Vreth Dominion. The Vreth had come from the dark rim of the galaxy, where no civilized species had bothered to explore, and they had spent centuries studying the Concordat from the shadows and learning every weakness and every vulnerability. Now they struck with precision that bordered on cruelty, and their biological weapons were tailored to each species, and their tactics exploited every known limitation of Concordat military doctrine. "We have lost contact with the Theshan homeworld," reported Admiral Vex of the Kalori fleet, and his 4 eyes blinked in a pattern that indicated deep distress. The Vreth deployed atmospheric processors that converted their air into poison within 6 hours. The representatives of the Theshan people sat in stunned silence because they had just learned that their entire civilization had been reduced to the few million who lived on colony worlds. Solen felt the weight of 6,000 years of tradition pressing down on her shoulders, and she knew that the Concordat was failing, and that their rules of civilized warfare meant nothing to an enemy who had never agreed to follow them. "We need new allies," she said, and the chamber fell silent because everyone knew what she was about to propose. 40 years ago, a Concordat survey ship had discovered a small blue world in an unremarkable solar system, and the inhabitants had called it Earth and themselves humanity. The initial reports had been fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. Humanity had achieved spaceflight despite having no contact with galactic civilization, and they had split the atom and built weapons capable of destroying their own world multiple times over, and they had done this while still fighting wars among themselves. The Concordat had immediately classified Earth as a quarantine zone and a developing species reservation, and they had placed monitoring stations throughout the solar system to watch and wait and study. Ambassador Kethra had spent 20 years on those monitoring stations and had become the galaxy's foremost expert on human behavior and culture, and now she rose to address the Council. "High Arbiter," she said, and her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen things that had changed her understanding of the universe. "I must strongly advise against this course of action." "We need soldiers," Solen replied. "The Vreth are winning because they do not follow our rules, and perhaps we need allies who also do not follow rules." Kethra's scales shifted to a deep purple that indicated profound unease, and she activated her own holographic display which showed footage from Earthwatch. She said, "The Council saw images of human history, and they watched armies march across frozen wastelands, and they watched cities burn, and they watched soldiers charge into certain death while screaming the names of their homelands. They watched humans strap explosives to their own bodies, and they watched them dig tunnels under enemy lines and fill them with enough explosive material to reshape the landscape, and they watched them develop weapons that could poison the air and water and soil for generations. This is how they treat each other." Kethra said, "These are not wars against alien invaders or existential threats, but conflicts over territory and resources and ideas, and sometimes just pride." The Council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "They have a concept called total war," Kethra continued. "It means the complete mobilization of a society for the purpose of destroying another society. And it means that there are no civilians and no protected zones and no limits on what can be targeted." "Barbaric," muttered the Veloci representative. "Effective," Kethra replied. In their last major conflict, they killed 70 million of their own kind in 6 years, and at the end of it, they had developed weapons that could crack the crust of a planet, and they used 2 of them on cities filled with civilians to end the war faster. Selene absorbed this information, and she thought about the Vreth and their tailored bioweapons and their contempt for the rules that had governed galactic warfare for millennia. What happens if we bring them in? She asked. Cathra was silent for a long moment. I do not know, she admitted. They are unpredictable in ways that my models cannot account for, and they form attachments that override their survival instincts, and they will sacrifice themselves for strangers, if those strangers are perceived as part of their group. That sounds like loyalty, Selene said. It is something beyond loyalty, Cathra replied. They call it many things in love and duty and honor and spite, and they will walk into certain death for any of these reasons, and they will drag their enemies down with them out of pure stubbornness. The vote was called, and the council deliberated for 3 days, and in those 3 days, 2 more worlds fell to the Vreth, and the refugee ships streamed toward the core systems with tales of horror and atrocity. When the final vote was counted, the decision to contact humanity passed by a single margin. Cathra stood alone in her chambers that night, and she looked out at the stars, and she wondered what they had just set in motion. She had not told the council everything, because some things were too difficult to explain to species who had never known true desperation. Humans did not just fight to win, and they did not just fight to survive. They fought because something deep in their biology refused to accept defeat. And they fought because surrender was worse than death, and they fought because they had spent their entire evolutionary history as prey animals who had somehow clawed their way to the top of their food chain through sheer bloody-minded refusal to give up. The Vreth had studied the Concordat for centuries, and they knew every weakness and every vulnerability. But they had never studied humanity, and Cathra knew with cold certainty that when humans entered this war, they would not fight like the Concordat, and they would not negotiate like the Concordat, and they would not stop like the Concordat. They would fight like humans, and the galaxy would never be the same. The diplomatic fleet departed for Earth the next morning, and Cathra watched it go, and she whispered a prayer to God she did not believe in. Forgive us, she said. We do not know what we have done. Admiral Sarah Chun had served in the United Nations Space Force for 30 years, and she had seen things that would have broken lesser officers, but nothing had prepared her for the moment when alien ships appeared in Earth orbit and requested permission to land. The Concordat delegation arrived aboard the Ans Perseverance in a shuttle that looked like it had been grown rather than built, and the aliens who emerged were beautiful and terrifying and ancient in ways that made humanity feel like children playing with toys. High Arbiter Selene led the delegation, and she moved with the grace of a species that had been civilized for longer than humans had existed, and her translator device rendered her words in perfect English. With just a hint of condescension, we come to offer humanity a gift, Selene said. A place among the stars, and a seat at the galactic table, and recognition as a developing species with potential. Chun listened without expression, and she noted the careful phrasing and the subtle implications, and she had spent too many years in military intelligence to miss the desperation hidden beneath the diplomatic polish. What do you want in return? She asked. Selene's composure flickered for just a moment, and then she activated a holographic display that showed the galaxy, the Vreth Dominion, she said, and the display zoomed in on a region of space that was marked in angry red. They emerged from the Dark Rim 18 months ago, and they have been systematically destroying everything in their path. The display showed footage, and Chun watched cities burn, and she watched civilians running from ships that blotted out the sky, and she watched weapons that seemed to dissolve matter itself. We need soldiers, Selene admitted. The Vreth do not follow the rules of civilized warfare, and our fleets were designed for a different kind of conflict. Chun studied the footage for several long minutes, and she asked questions about Wrath tactics and capabilities. And weaknesses in the Concordat representatives answered with the weary patience of people who had already tried everything. "Tell me about your rules," Chun said. Selene seemed surprised by the question, but she explained the Concordat conventions on warfare, which had governed galactic conflict for 4,000 years. Limited engagements with clearly defined objectives and protected zones around civilian populations and medical facilities, and proportional responses that matched the scale of provocation, and mandatory ceasefires for negotiation after any battle that resulted in more than 10,000 casualties. Wars can last for centuries, Selene said, but they remain civilized and infrastructure is preserved, and populations survive, and eventually a diplomatic solution is reached. Chun was silent for a long moment, and she thought about human history, and she thought about Dresden, and Hiroshima, and the trenches of the Somme, and the burning of Atlanta. "Why haven't you won?" she asked. The Concordat representatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. "The Vreth do not follow our conventions," Admiral Vex said. "They target civilians deliberately, and they use weapons banned by treaty, and they refuse to negotiate. And you keep following your rules anyway," Chum said. "Of course," Selene replied. "To abandon our principles would be to become no better than them." Chun nodded slowly, and she turned to look out the viewport at the blue curve of Earth below. "Show me their homeworld," she said. The request seemed to confuse the aliens. "The Vreth homeworld is deep in the Dark Rim," Vex said. "It has no strategic relevance to the current front lines. Show me where they sleep," Chun said, and her voice was quiet, but something in it made the aliens shift uncomfortably. "Show me where their children are and where their leaders feel safe and where they go when they want to forget about the war." Selene stared at the human admiral, and for the first time, she understood why Kethra had warned them. "Admiral Chun," she said carefully, "targeting civilian populations is forbidden by the Concordat conventions, and it serves no military purpose. It served plenty of purpose in our history." Chun replied, "You want to know why humans fight the way we do, and it is because we learned a long time ago that wars are not won by armies, but by breaking the will of the enemy to continue fighting. That is barbaric." Vax said, "That is effective," Chun replied, and she smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. "You came to us because your civilized warfare was failing, and you came to us because the Vreth do not follow your rules, and you want us to fight for you." She turned to face the delegation fully. "We will not fight for you," she said. "We will fight with you, but only on our terms, and our terms are simple." She held up one finger. "First, we will have full access to all Concordat technology and manufacturing capability, because we learn fast and we improve everything we touch." A second finger. "Second, we will command our own forces, and we will not answer to Concordat admirals who will try to make us fight like you fight." A third finger. "Third, you will not interfere with our methods, and you will not try to apply your conventions to our operations, and you will not question our decisions." Selene felt cold, despite the carefully controlled temperature of the ship. "What exactly do you intend to do?" she asked. Chun's smile widened. "We intend to win," she said, "and we intend to make sure that the Vreth understand exactly what it costs to threaten innocent lives. And we intend to end this war, not in centuries, but in years." "How?" Vex demanded. Chun pulled up her own display, and it showed a simple map of Vreth space with their homeworld at the center. "You fight their fleets," she said. "You defend your worlds, and you follow your rules, and you wait for them to come to you." She drew a line straight through Vreth territory to their homeworld. "We go straight for the heart," she said. "We hit them where they feel safe, and we make them afraid, and we do not stop until they surrender, or until there is nothing left to surrender." The Concordat delegation sat in stunned silence. "You would kill billions," Selene whispered. "They kill billions first," Chun replied. And they will kill billions more if we do not stop them, and the difference between us and you is that we understand that sometimes mercy requires cruelty. She leaned forward. Do we have a deal? Selene thought about the worlds already lost, and the worlds that would fall while they debated ethics, and she thought about Kethra's warnings, and she thought about what it meant to unleash humanity on the galaxy. We have a deal, she said. Chun nodded, and she extended her hand in the human gesture of agreement. Then let us go to war, she said, and somewhere in the dark rim of the galaxy, the Vreth continued their advance, completely unaware that everything was about to change. Supreme Commander Vekthar of the Vreth, Dominion received the intelligence report about humanity with something close to amusement and his species, communicated through a combination of pheromones and subsonic vibrations, and the pattern he released was one of dismissal. A primitive species confined to a single solar system had joined the war, and they had chemical rockets and fragile bodies and lifespans so short that a Vreth child would outlive 3 generations of them. Allocate minimal resources to monitoring their activity, he ordered. They are not a threat. This was his first mistake. 3 months after the alliance was signed, a human fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Keseth system, and the Vreth defense commander was so surprised that he forgot to raise shields for nearly 30 seconds. Keseth Prime was a military staging ground, and it had been designed to be impregnable with orbital defense platforms and ground-based weapons, and a garrison of 50,000 Vreth soldiers. The human fleet was smaller than anyone had expected, and it consisted of ships that looked crude and angular compared to the elegant curves of Concordat vessels, and the Vreth commander felt something like pity for these primitive creatures who had come so far to die. He opened a communication channel. Attention, human vessels. A broadcast. You have entered Vreth territory without authorization, and you are outgunned and outnumbered. And if you surrender now, we will grant you quick deaths. The humans did not respond. I repeat, the commander said, you are advised to surrender immediately or face destruction. Silence the Vreth. Commander ordered his fleet to form a standard defensive formation, and he prepared a demonstration of firepower that would surely convince these primitives to see reason. The human ships did not slow down, and they did not change course, and they flew directly at the Vreth formation at speeds that should have been impossible. They are not responding to hails, an officer reported, and their weapons are powering up. Then destroy them, the commander ordered. The Vreth fleet opened fire, and their weapons were advanced and powerful, and they had destroyed Concordat ships with ease. The first human ship took a direct hit, and its shields flared and then failed, and the hull began to break apart. And then something impossible happened. The dying ship released a swarm of smaller vessels that moved within human speed and precision, and they were not crude, and they were autonomous drones that learned and adapted in real time, and they swarmed through the Vreth formation like angry insects. The second human ship launched missiles that accelerated at rates that should have torn them apart, and these missiles did not explode on impact, but instead drilled through Vreth armor and detonated inside the ships. The third human ship deployed something that made the Vreth sensors scream warnings, and it was a weapon that used nuclear explosions to pump coherent beams of X-rays, and each beam was powerful enough to cut a cruiser in half. Fall back, the commander ordered, but his voice was lost in the chaos, and his officers were too busy trying to survive to hear him. The human fleet did not fight like any enemy the Vreth had faced, and they did not maintain formation, and they did not protect their flanks, and they did not seem to care about casualties. A human destroyer took critical damage, and instead of retreating, it accelerated directly at a Vreth dreadnought, and the destroyer captain broadcast one final message before impact. See you in hell. The destroyer hit the dreadnought at nearly half the speed of light, and the resulting explosion destroyed both ships and damaged 3 more Vreth vessels. The Vreth commander watched in horror as another human ship deliberately rammed an orbital defense platform, and his human soldiers in powered armor breached his flagship and fought hand-to-hand in corridors. Designed for creatures twice their size, he had studied war for 2 centuries, and he had never seen anything like this. The humans were dying, and their ships were burning, and they were losing, and they did not seem to care. They kept coming. They kept fighting. A human marine with both legs crushed beneath debris pulled herself forward with her arms and killed 3 Vreth soldiers with a weapon she had taken from a dead comrade before finally succumbing to her wounds. A human pilot whose cockpit had been breached and who was slowly suffocating used his last moments to guide his damaged fighter into a Vreth hangar bay. A human engineer who could have escaped through a lifeboat instead stayed at his post to keep the weapons firing, and he sang an old song from Earth as the flames consumed him. The battle lasted 4 hours, and when it was over, Kesseth Prime had fallen. Across the galaxy, every species with access to military intelligence watched the footage in silence. And they saw the casualty reports, and they saw that the humans had lost 60% of their fleet. They also saw that the humans had won. Admiral Chun reviewed the reports from the Perseverance, and she noted the losses without expression, and she began planning the next attack. Send a message to the Vreth Supreme Commander, she said. Tell him that Kesseth Prime was just the beginning, and tell him that we are coming, and tell him that we do not accept surrender. Her officers exchanged glances. Ma'am, one of them said, the Concordat Conventions require that we accept surrender. We are not bound by the Concordat Conventions, Chum replied, and the Vreth showed no mercy to the species they conquered, and they will receive no mercy from us. She looked at the star map, and she traced the path to the Vreth homeworld. They wanted a war, she said. Now they have one. On. Sentinel Prime Ambassador Kethra watched the battle footage for the 10th time, and she paid special attention to the human faces, and she saw the fear and the pain and the determination. She also saw something else, and it took her a long time to identify it: joy. The humans were terrified and dying, and they were also experiencing something that looked very much like savage joy, and they were finally facing an enemy worthy of their full attention, and they were unleashing centuries of pent-up aggression on a target that actually deserved it. Kethra understood then what she had failed to explain to the Council. Humans did not fight despite their fear. They fought because of it. They had evolved on a world that wanted to kill them. And they had survived by being more stubborn and more vicious and more adaptable than anything else on their planet. The Vreth were strong and cruel and ancient, but they had never met anything like humanity. And now it was too late to go back. The Vreth Dominion responded to the fall of Kesseth Prime with overwhelming force, and Supreme Commander Vector assembled the largest fleet in his species history, and he gave orders that would have horrified even his own people a generation ago. Target their colonies, he commanded. Kill their civilians and burn their worlds, and make them understand that they have challenged an empire that has crushed 100 species before them. The Vreth struck at New Singapore and New Mumbai and New Lagos and the human colonies that had been established in the years since first contact. They deployed the same biological weapons they had used against the Concordat, and they bombed population centers, and they broadcast footage of human civilians dying in the hopes that it would break human morale. They expected humanity to negotiate. They expected humanity to beg for peace. They expected humanity to behave rationally. Instead, humanity got angry. Admiral Chun watched the footage from New Mumbai with an expression that made her officers step back, and she said nothing for a very long time. And then she issued a single order: Operation Stalingrad. The name meant nothing to the Concordat observers who had been assigned to the human fleet, but it sent a chill down the spines of every human who heard it. The war changed after that. Human commanders began using tactics from their own bloody history, and they studied the campaigns of Alexander and Caesar and Napoleon and Rommel and Zhukov, and they adapted ancient strategies to stellar warfare. They used deception on a scale the galaxy had never seen, and they created fake fleet movements and false intelligence, and they let the Vreth intercept communications that were designed to mislead. They turned asteroids into weapons and accelerated them to relativistic speeds and dropped them on Vreth military installations with precision that seemed impossible. They established networks of spies and informants among the slave species the Vreth had conquered, and they armed resistance movements and funded rebellions and turned the Vreth Empire against itself from within. They broadcast messages directly to Vreth civilians, and these messages showed footage of Vreth prisoners of war being treated well and fed and given medical care, and the messages asked why the Vreth government was sacrificing so many lives for a war they could not win. The psychological warfare was devastating because the Vreth had never faced an enemy who understood propaganda and the power of ideas. A Vreth admiral named Keshver captured a human pilot during a skirmish near the Theta Cygni system, and he had the pilot brought before him for interrogation. The pilot was young and female, and she had been wounded during the battle, and she smiled at Keshver with blood on her teeth. "Why do you fight so hard?" Keshver demanded. "Your species was not even involved in this war until recently, and the Concordat treated you like primitives and kept you confined to your solar system, and you owed them nothing." The pilot laughed, and the sound made Keshver uncomfortable in ways he could not explain. "You think we are fighting for them?" she said. "You think we are fighting for the Concordat and their rules and their civilization? Then why?" Keshver asked. "Because you hurt people," the pilot replied. "You attacked worlds that had done nothing to you, and you killed children. And you thought there would be no consequences, and where we come from, that means you answer to us. You cannot win." Keshver said, "You are a single species against an empire that has existed for 10,000 years. The pilot's smile widened. "We do not need to win," she said. "We just need to make sure you lose, and we just need to make you pay for every life you took, and we just need to ensure that when this is over, the galaxy remembers what happens when you wake up humanity." Keshver had her executed, but her words haunted him. The Concordat Council watched the war unfold with growing unease, and they had wanted soldiers, and they had received something else entirely. Human engineers improved Concordat weapon systems in ways that had been technically possible, but ethically unthinkable, and they removed the safety limiters and increased the yield and optimized for destruction rather than precision. Human officers attended strategy meetings and proposed operations that made seasoned alien commanders physically ill, and they spoke casually about acceptable casualties and strategic bombardment and scorched earth tactics. A Telori admiral asked a human colonel how he could propose destroying an entire moon just to eliminate a single Vreth shipyard. The colonel looked at him with genuine confusion. "Because it will work," he said, "and because the Vreth used bioweapons on our colonies, and there are no innocent targets anymore." Ambassador Kethra submitted a revised report on humanity to the Concordat Council. "They are not more violent than us," she wrote. "They are more committed, and they do not see war as a negotiation by other means, and they do not see enemy civilians as neutral parties, and they do not see their own casualties as a reason to stop. They see war as a problem to be solved, and they will solve it by whatever method works, and they will not stop until the problem no longer exists. We asked them to fight for us, and they have done so, and now we must accept the consequences of what we have unleashed." High Arbiter Solène read the report, and she thought about the worlds that had been saved and the worlds that had been lost, and she wondered if history would judge her as a hero or a monster. The war entered its second year, and humanity had pushed the Vreth back to their core systems, and the Supreme Commander had lost half his fleet, and the slave species were rising up across the Empire, and still the humans kept coming. They named their operations after ancient battles, and Thermopylae, and Stalingrad, and Rorke's Drift. and each name was a promise and a threat. They wrote messages on their missiles, and the messages said things like, "From New Mumbai with love," and "Remember the children." They did not negotiate, they did not slow down, they did not stop, and the galaxy watched and trembled and understood that they had woken something that would never go back to sleep. Supreme Commander Vecthar stood before the assembled War Council of the Vreth Dominion, and for the first time in his long life, he felt something that might have been fear. The Empire was crumbling, and the slave species had risen up, and the fleet had been decimated by an enemy that should have been nothing more than a footnote in galactic history. "We have one option remaining," he said. "We strike at their homeworld and we threaten Earth itself, and we force them to choose between their planet and their war." The council agreed because they had no other choice, and the largest remaining Vreth fleet assembled at the edge of the Dark Rim. 100 dreadnoughts and 500 cruisers and 2,000 support vessels, and it was enough firepower to crack a planet. They jumped to Earth, and they found humanity waiting for them in the 18 months since first contact. Humanity had transformed their solar system into a fortress, and they had built orbital defense platforms around Earth and Mars and the moons of Jupiter, and they had turned asteroids into weapons platforms, and they had armed civilian ships. And they had prepared for exactly this moment. Admiral Chun stood on the bridge of the UN's Unconquered, and she watched the Vreth fleet emerge from faster than light travel, and she smiled. "All stations report ready." Her first officer said, "Good." Chun replied, "Send the message." The message was broadcast on all frequencies, and it was simple. "Welcome to Earth, and welcome to the end of your empire, and you should have stayed in the dark." The battle for Earth began with the Vreth fleet, advancing in perfect formation and confident in their superior numbers, and expecting the humans to flee or surrender. The humans did not flee. The humans did not surrender. The orbital defense platforms opened fire with weapons that had been designed in secret and built in desperation, and each shot carried the weight of every human who had died in this war. Ground-based railguns fired continuously, and their barrels glowed red and then white, and still they kept firing until the metal itself began to warp and melt. Human civilian ships that had been converted to warships threw themselves at Vreth cruisers, and their crews knew they were going to die, and they did not care because they were protecting their home. A freighter captain named Maria Santos rammed her ship into a Vreth dreadnought that was approaching Earth orbit, and her last words were a prayer for her children who were hiding in a bunker below. A teenager named James Kim, who had lied about his age to join the defense force, piloted a fighter into the heart of the Vreth formation and took out 3 enemy ships before his own was destroyed. An old woman named Grandmother Chun, who was no relation to the admiral, fired an ancient anti-aircraft gun at Vreth landing craft from the roof of her apartment building, and she killed 17 enemy soldiers before they found her. The battle raged for 3 days, and the losses were catastrophic on both sides and the space around. Earth was filled with debris and bodies, and the wreckage of 1,000 ships. The Vreth landed troops on 3 continents, and they expected the civilian population to flee or surrender. Instead, they found resistance. Every city became a fortress, and every street became a killing ground, and every human who could hold a weapon picked one up and fought. The Vreth soldiers were stronger and faster and better equipped, and none of them mattered because they were fighting an enemy that did not know how to give up. An unarmed factory worker tackled a Vreth soldier and held him down long enough for his co-workers to beat the alien to death with tools. A schoolteacher led her students through the sewers to safety and then went back for more, and she saved 200 children before a Vreth patrol finally caught her. A priest stood in the doorway of his church and refused to let the Vreth enter, and they killed him. And then they found that the congregation had armed themselves with whatever they could find, and the battle for that single building lasted 6 hours. When the ammunition ran out, the human soldiers fixed bayonets, and the Vreth had never seen such a thing. and they did not understand why humans would charge at them with knives on the end of their rifles when they could simply retreat. They broke formation and they ran, and that was when the tide turned. Admiral Chen led the assault on the Vreth flagship personally, and her boarding party cut through the enemy ship deck by deck and corridor by corridor, and they did not stop for rest or food or medical treatment. She reached the command deck covered in blood that was mostly not her own, and Supreme Commander Vecthar stood waiting for her. "Why?" he asked, and his voice carried something like respect. "Why you fight like this, and why you sacrifice so much, and you could have surrendered, and you could have negotiated, and you could have lived." Chan looked at him with eyes that had seen too much death. "We do not fight because we think we will win," she said. "We fight because we decided a long time ago that some things are worth everything, and you came to our home, and you threatened our children, and now you are going to learn what that costs." She raised her weapon. "The Vreth Dominion is over," she said. "Surrender now, and your people will live and fight, and I will end your species as thoroughly as you tried to end the Deshans." Vecthar looked at this small, fragile human, and he saw in her eyes the same thing that had been in the eyes of every human he had encountered: absolute refusal to accept defeat. He surrendered. The news spread across the galaxy in hours, and the Vreth Dominion collapsed, and the slave species rose up and declared independence, and the war was over. The Galactic Concordat offered humanity full membership and a seat on the High Council and recognition as equals among the stars. The human delegation accepted graciously, and they smiled and shook hands and signed treaties, and they were polite and diplomatic, and every species in the galaxy looked at those smiles and remembered what they had seen. They remembered the humans laughing as their ships burned, and the soldiers who kept fighting with missing limbs, and the civilians who charged alien warriors with kitchen knives. They remembered the fury and the stubbornness and the absolute refusal to yield. High Arbiter Selin returned to her private chambers, and she wrote in her personal log, "We woke them because we were desperate. And we brought them into our wars because we had no other choice, and they saved us, and they terrified us. And now we must live in a galaxy where humanity knows we exist and knows how to find us. They are friendly now and curious and eager to learn, and they make excellent trade partners, and they speak of peace and cooperation. But I have seen what they become when they are threatened, and I have seen what they will do to protect those they love. And I know that somewhere in their genes is a capacity for violence that makes even the Vreth look civilized. We are safe as long as we remain their friends. May our descendants never forget that." Humanity settled into galactic society, and they built trade networks and established embassies and sent explorers to the far reaches of the cosmos. They were kind and generous, and they helped rebuild the worlds the Vreth had destroyed. And they welcomed refugees and shared their technology freely. No one ever threatened them again. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the stars shone down on 1,000 worlds, the older species would look up and remember. They had woken humanity, and the galaxy would never be the same.